She thought it would be a funny way to put him in his place in front of her wealthy guests, but when the maid's quiet son sat down at the chessboard, no one expected what happened next. His first move silenced the entire room, and by the end, the millionaire realized she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Subscribe and write where you're watching this video from. The heat of the Atlanta evening pressed against the windows of the bus as it rattled through the cracked streets, humming with the tired breaths of workers returning home or heading toward a second shift that would end long after midnight. Outside, the sunset painted the sky with shades of burnt peach and deep violet. But inside the bus, the air was thick with the smell of sweat and resignation. Sarah sat near the window, her hands folded tightly on her lap, a plastic bag with two neatly folded cleaning uniforms beside her, her eyes half closed as she recited her list for the next day in her mind, so as not to forget when exhaustion finally claimed her. Beside her, Elijah sat quietly, his thin shoulders pressed against the seat, his knees bouncing slightly with the anxious energy of a 15-year-old who had learned too early how to be invisible. In his pocket, he held a small plastic knight he had found in the library's lost and found box weeks ago, the bottom chipped, but the piece still standing proud with its carved horse head, a talisman he rubbed when the world outside felt too big, too loud, too indifferent. The bus squeaked to a halt, and Sarah stood, adjusting the bag on her wrist, pulling her son with a light tug toward the doors. They stepped off into the thick summer air, the gravel crunching under their shoes as they began the slow walk toward the gated community where she worked, the place they would leave their own streets' cracked sidewalks behind and enter a world lined with manicured hedge, electric gates, and soft lights glowing in lanterns along wide driveways. They arrived before the sky had fully darkened, the security guard at the gate barely glancing at them, pressing a button to let them in as Sarah mumbled a quiet thank you, her eyes lowered, her shoulders instinctively curving inward as she passed under the heavy ironwork arch that marked the beginning of a world she cleaned but never lived in. The Whitman house stood at the highest point of the hill, its grand facade washed in lights that made the white columns glow, the brass fixtures on the double doors polished to a mirror shine. Sarah led Elijah around the back, through the service entrance where the other staff entered, past the kitchens where the scent of lemon polish and cold marble met the air. She greeted the cook with a quiet nod, handed her bag to the small closet she was assigned, and glanced at Elijah with a look that was both warning and apology. "Stay here. Stay quiet," her eyes said as she left him near the pantry, her black shoes whispering across the tiles as she moved to start her evening rounds. Elijah remained standing, the soft hum of the air conditioning and the ticking of a large wall clock filling the silence. The house was alive in a way his home never was, with distant laughter echoing from polished halls and the faint strains of a piano from somewhere upstairs. He walked slowly, carefully, letting his fingertips brush against the edges of the walls, the frames of paintings, the cold surfaces of side tables. Every corner felt like a promise he wasn't meant to touch, and yet he moved quietly, drawn by the strange warmth that pulsed beneath the cold perfection of the house. He found the library when he turned down a long corridor lined with tall windows that reflected the night's darkness back at him. The double doors were open, revealing shelves that reached toward the ceiling, lined with hardback books, their spines rich with gold lettering and dark leathers that smelled of age and dust. A heavy table sat in the center of the room, a chessboard carved from ivory and obsidian inlaid within its surface, pieces arranged in the opening position, waiting, patient, eternal. Elijah felt something in his chest tighten, a sharp, eager spark as he approached the board, the knight in his pocket suddenly heavy against his leg. He reached out carefully, his fingers hovering over the polished surface before gently touching the pawn, sliding it forward one square and then back, aligning it exactly as it had been. He stood there, his mind replaying moves he had memorized from torn pages of a library book, the echo of grandmasters whose names he had whispered to himself like prayers in the quiet corners of the library near his home. This was not his board, not his house, and yet, for a moment, standing there under the warm glow of the reading lamp, the marble floor cold beneath his thin shoes, he felt a fragile ownership in the air around him. The sound of heels clicking on the marble outside the library made him pull his hand back sharply. Stepping away from the table, his breath caught in his chest. He ducked behind a tall chair as a woman entered the room. Tall, with silver hair swept back in an elegant twist, her perfume arriving before her, floral and sharp, her heels pausing as she glanced at the board. Margaret Whitman surveyed the room with a detached interest, her eyes drifting over the chessboard without suspicion, her mind elsewhere, thinking of the dinner she would host the next evening, the guests she would entertain, the smiles she would give with precise calculation. She turned, leaving as quickly as she had entered, and Elijah let out the breath he had been holding, his heart drumming in his ears. He returned to the service hall, his mother's small figure appearing around the corner with a tray in her hands, her eyes softening with relief when she saw him safe, untouched, unseen. They walked home that night as the sky finally darkened completely. Stars hidden by the haze of city lights, the warm breeze carrying the distant scent of cut grass and summer dust. Their small apartment felt tighter that night, the air heavier as they sat at the kitchen table. Sarah quietly spooning rice and beans onto their plates, her hands moving mechanically as she listened to the silence between them. Elijah looked at the chipped knight in his hand, remembering the feeling of the cold pawn beneath his fingers, the way the library smelled like old wood and opportunity, the way the pieces had stood ready for him. His mother looked at him, her eyes lined with worry and exhaustion, and then at his closed hand, saying nothing, but her gaze lingering there as if she could see through his skin to the dreams forming beneath. As the night grew deeper, and Sarah finally lay down on the thin mattress in the corner of their shared room, Elijah sat at the small desk they had salvaged from a yard sale, pulling out a notebook with the edges curled from humidity, a pencil worn down nearly to the metal. He began to draw the chessboard from memory, carefully marking the squares, the positions, the notations of openings he had memorized, his hand steady even as his eyelids grew heavy. His mother turned in her sleep, murmuring softly, the sound of her breath a constant in the darkness, grounding him as he wrote down the names of moves. Sicilian defense, Queen's Gambit, King's Indian. Words that felt like keys, words that felt like a promise that there was more, always more, if he could find a way to take it. Outside their window, the night carried on without them, the hum of cars on the distant highway, the occasional shout from the street below, a dog barking once and then falling silent. Inside, the air was filled with the soft scratching of pencil on paper, the slow, steady breath of a woman who had given everything she had for her child, and the quiet, determined heartbeat of a boy who, even in the dark, was reaching for something beyond the lines drawn for him. He fell asleep at the desk, his head resting on the notebook. The last thing he saw before dreams took him was the square on the paper marked E4, the first move in the game, the first step onto the board, the first breath of a possibility that he would one day stand at the center of that marble library floor not as a shadow, but as a player, ready, unafraid, waiting for the world to make its move. When the dawn came, breaking over the rooftops and spilling pale light into their small apartment, Elijah woke with a stiff neck, the imprint of the pencil pressing into his cheek. His mother already up, the sound of water boiling, the smell of coffee thin and bitter but warm. She looked at him with a tired smile, touching his hair lightly as she passed. The briefest moment of comfort before she pulled on her shoes, tied her apron around her waist, and prepared to step once more into the world that saw her only as a service, not as a woman, not as a mother, not as a person. Elijah folded the notebook, slipping it into his backpack, feeling the weight of it against his spine as he stood, looking out the window at the world waiting beyond, at the rising sun that did not care who was rich or poor, who belonged or did not. He glanced back once at his mother, who stood in the doorway, adjusting her bag on her shoulder, her eyes meeting his with a quiet strength that told him more than words ever could. And together they stepped out into the morning, the bus waiting down the street, the hill waiting beyond, the house with its shining windows and perfect gardens waiting at the top. Elijah felt the night in his pocket, the cold certainty of the board in his mind, and he knew, as the bus pulled away from the curb, that the first move had already been made. The morning light glided over the city's low rooftops as the bus turned onto the shaded road leading to the hill, where the houses rose like white ships above the hush of the city. Elijah sat by the window, watching the slow drift of leaves against the curb as they passed, the world rolling past him like a moving painting he could not yet enter. His mother sat next to him, clutching the small bag of lunch she had prepared, her eyes ahead, steady, her shoulders drawn back in quiet readiness for the day. They did not speak, but between them lived the memory of the night before, of the way Elijah had looked at the chessboard, of the way she had seen something unspoken flicker in his eyes, something that frightened her even as it made her proud. When they stepped off the bus and passed through the gates, the air changed, carrying the sharp scent of cut grass and expensive cologne that clung to the breeze. The Whitman house was alive that morning, humming with preparations. Vans arrived with boxes of glassware and crates of wine. Staff in crisp uniforms moved back and forth through the service entrance, carrying trays and linens, their eyes lowered as they worked in synchronized silence. Sarah adjusted her apron in the back hall, rolling her sleeves as she received instructions from the housekeeper, a woman with clipped words and cold eyes who moved like a metronome through the day, ensuring every glass was polished to a flawless shine, every napkin folded precisely. Elijah found his quiet corner near the pantry, just out of sight, but close enough to see his mother as she moved through the house, polishing the stair railings, checking the corners of the windows for dust, rearranging the vases of flowers brought in that morning, their petals too perfect to have grown in real dirt. He watched the way she paused to adjust her headscarf, to press a hand against her lower back when she thought no one was looking, and it filled him with a tightness in his chest, a promise he could not yet shape with words. From his place, he could see the large hallway where portraits of Whitman ancestors lined the walls, their pale faces gazing out from gilded frames with eyes that seemed to follow every movement. Upstairs, Margaret Whitman stood before the mirror in her dressing room, the pale blue of her silk dress catching the light as she turned slightly, examining the fall of the fabric along her arm, the line of her shoulders. Her silver hair was pinned up neatly, each strand combed into place, a string of pearls resting against her collarbone like a cold smile. She lifted her chin as she practiced her greeting, the soft curve of her lips never touching her eyes. Behind her, the maid who had helped with her hair retreated quietly, carrying away the scattered pins, her eyes fixed on the floor. Margaret barely noticed her leave, her mind already moving ahead to the evening, to the names of the guests who would arrive, to the careful arrangement of the seating that ensured power and favor were never far from her reach. The day settled into its rhythm, with the kitchen clattering in preparation, the smell of roasting meats and baking bread layering the air with a warmth that did not reach the high, polished halls. The service staff moved quietly, efficiently, setting the table in the grand dining room with plates so fine they seemed fragile beneath the chandelier's glow, silverware lined like soldiers in perfect rows. Elijah slipped from his place to help his mother carry in folded linens, his small hands smoothing out the edges as she placed them along the sideboard, the two of them working in silent accord, sharing brief glances that were their secret language. As the afternoon waned, cars began to arrive, sleek and dark, the gravel crunching softly under thick tires as men in suits stepped out, adjusting their cuffs, women with diamonds at their throats descending gracefully from passenger seats, laughter already rising in the twilight. They were greeted at the door by Margaret, who stood with a glass of champagne in her hand, her smile warm but precise, offering words that fell around her guests like petals, practiced and effortless. Her eyes scanned the drive as each guest arrived, checking her mental list, noting who came alone, who came late, who came looking to impress. Inside, the rooms filled with voices, the air buzzing with polite conversation, laughter that rose and fell like a tide, phrases of charity and politics and travel looping through the space with practiced ease. Crystal glasses clinked, waiters moved silently with trays of small bites, and the scent of perfume and cologne built into a sweet, cloying haze. Elijah moved along the walls, carrying a tray of empty glasses back to the kitchen, catching fragments of conversation as he passed. Words about fundraisers, about stocks, about charity galas, about children at expensive schools learning horseback riding and French. At one point, as he leaned down to pick up a glass that had rolled under the table, he found himself at eye level with a woman's dropped clutch, the pearls and silver of its clasp glinting in the light. Instinctively, he reached out, picking it up and holding it out with both hands, his eyes lowered. The woman paused, looking down at him with a small, stiff smile that did not reach her eyes, her fingers hesitating before taking it back. "Thank you," she said, and there was a pause, a breath of something cold between them before she turned back to her conversation, her laughter resuming as if he had never been there. Elijah's cheeks warmed, but he turned quickly, moving back toward the kitchen, the weight of the moment clinging to him like dust. In the kitchen, Sarah reached out and touched his shoulder gently, her eyes full of quiet understanding, a question she did not ask as he set the tray down and helped to stack dishes. She pressed her hand briefly to his cheek before returning to her work, wiping down a counter that was already spotless. The evening grew deeper, the lights in the chandeliers brightening as the sun finally sank below the hills, the house glowing like a lantern on the darkened street. In the library, the chessboard still sat untouched, the pieces waiting, the room filled with the scent of polished wood and old paper. Guests wandered in and out, some pausing to admire the shelves, others running their fingers along the spines of books they would never read, making small remarks about the beauty of the room, about how they should learn to play chess, laughing at their own declarations. Margaret stood with a group near the doorway, her laughter ringing softly as she shared a story about a senator's wife who had tripped at a previous gala, a story that drew polite, conspiratorial laughter from those around her. Her eyes flickered toward the chessboard as she spoke, a small idea forming in her mind, something to entertain, something to please her guests, something that would set the evening apart from others. She lifted her glass slightly, her eyes moving past the cluster of well-dressed guests to where Elijah stood near the entry, his eyes watching, calm and dark. It was a small thing at first, the way her gaze lingered on him, the way her smile shifted, a thought forming behind her eyes. The laughter around her continued, but she was already turning the idea over in her mind, weighing it for its amusement, for the subtle demonstration of her place in this world, for the way it would please the watchers, the way it would reinforce the order she believed in so deeply. She spoke softly, a suggestion that rippled out from her circle, catching in the air like a spark. A few guests turned to look at Elijah, then back at Margaret, smiles rising, polite laughter bubbling again as the suggestion was repeated, the words shaped into a soft command. Sarah, from across the room, felt the air change, felt the sudden weight of eyes turning, the way the space around her son seemed to tighten. Her breath caught, a quiet panic rising in her as she stepped forward, but Margaret was already moving, her steps precise, her smile warm as she approached Elijah. The boy stood still, the tray in his hands, his eyes meeting hers with a calmness that surprised her, a calmness that made her pause, if only for a breath, before she extended her hand lightly toward the library, the chessboard waiting in the soft glow of the lamp. Around them, the room seemed to quiet, conversations slowing as the guests turned to watch, curiosity flickering in their eyes, the promise of amusement drawing them in like moths to the glow. Sarah's voice was a whisper, a plea as she reached her son's side, her hand on his arm, her eyes begging him to say no, to turn away, to let it pass, to let this moment slip back into the shadows where they had always lived, where it was safe. Elijah felt the warmth of her hand, the tremble in her grip, the years of fear and carefulness that shaped her every breath, every movement, every choice. He felt it all in that moment, and he turned his head to look at her, the calm still in his eyes, the promise he could not yet speak burning quietly there as he placed the tray down, gently, carefully. He turned back to Margaret, who smiled down at him, expecting a bow, expecting submission, expecting the small entertainment she desired. And Elijah nodded once, a quiet, measured gesture that rippled through the room like a breath, the first movement in a game that none of them yet understood. The library doors opened wider, the light spilling out onto the marble floor as Margaret gestured toward the board, her guests moving closer, their glasses in hand, their laughter softer now, anticipation sharpening their smiles. Elijah stepped forward, the sound of his shoes against the polished floor loud in his own ears, the night in his pocket a small, solid weight against his side. The chessboard waited, the pieces waiting, the room holding its breath around him as he took his place, lifting his eyes to meet the gaze of the woman across from him, her pearls catching the light, her smile still curved, confident, unknowing. The pieces stood between them, the squares stretching out like a quiet battlefield, and as Elijah lowered himself into the chair, the world seemed to narrow to the space between the black and white squares, to the space between his breath and the silence that was about to break. And as Margaret reached out, her manicured fingers closing around the pawn on E4, sliding it forward with precise elegance, Elijah's eyes followed the piece, the movement like the striking of a match, the beginning of a moment that would carry them all forward, whether they were ready or not. The room held its breath as the pawn moved across the polished inlaid board, a small, soft sound of ivory against wood that was almost drowned by the clink of glasses and the low conversations of guests gathering near the door. Yet, for Elijah, that sound was thunder, the first drumbeat of something that pulled the air tight in his chest and made his fingers curl slightly around the edge of the table. Margaret's hand withdrew gracefully, her pearl bracelet sliding against her wrist as she leaned back in her chair with the kind of comfortable confidence that came naturally to those who believed the world was designed to bend around them. Her eyes held a glint of polite amusement, the laughter of her friends echoing softly from behind her like distant bells at a wedding, a celebration of their own certainty. Elijah's eyes dropped to the board, tracing the path of the pawn to E4, the move as familiar to him as breathing. And, for a moment, the warmth of the room, the eyes on his back, the soft laughter and clinking glasses all faded until there was nothing but the board, the pieces waiting, the strategy humming beneath his skin like a second heartbeat. His mother's hand brushed against his shoulder, a fleeting pressure that told him everything she could not say. Her fear, her hope, the tightness in her voice that she swallowed to avoid drawing more attention, to avoid making a scene. He could feel her eyes on him as he lifted his hand, the calm in his veins steadying him as he touched the black pawn and moved it forward to C5, the first response in the Sicilian defense, a move he had practiced in libraries and on scraps of paper late into the night when the world was quiet. For a moment, there was silence, a soft hush that spread across the room as those who recognized the move exchanged glances, eyebrows lifting in mild surprise. One of the older men, a guest with silver hair and a gold watch peeking from beneath his cuff, leaned forward, adjusting his glasses as a small, interested smile touched his lips. Margaret's fingers paused as she reached for her next move, her eyes flicking up to Elijah's face, and for the briefest moment, he saw something shift in them, a flicker of reassessment that was gone almost as soon as it appeared. She moved another pawn forward, quick, decisive, seeking to control the center, and the game began to unfold with the smoothness of a dance. Each piece moved with the kind of quiet tension that drew the watching guests closer, soft conversations falling into silence as they watched the boy, with dark, calm eyes, counter each of Margaret's moves with unhurried precision. He did not rush, did not fidget, his movements deliberate as he reached for each piece, the chessboard reflecting softly in his eyes as if the black and white squares held the only truth in the room. Sarah stood near the doorway, her hands twisting in her apron, unable to look away as she watched her son sit across from the woman who held power over their days, who decided when Sarah could take a day off, who decided if they kept their small apartment, who decided if they were welcome or if they would be pushed out into the cold. She watched the way Elijah's shoulders remained steady, how he did not look away when Margaret's eyes found his, how he leaned forward slightly, studying the board, and moved with the confidence of someone who knew what he was doing, who knew he had the right to be there, even if the world tried to say otherwise. Margaret's smile began to tighten as the minutes passed, her laughter no longer light as she glanced around at the faces watching, at the way a few of her guests were nodding slightly in approval at the boy's play, at the way the silver-haired man now stood with his arms crossed, studying the board intently. She moved her pieces quickly, seeking to unsettle him, testing him with an aggressive knight maneuver, trying to bait him into a mistake, but Elijah's face remained calm, his dark eyes flicking over the board as he slid a bishop into position, defending without hesitation. There was a sharpness in the air now, a tension that had replaced the amusement, drawing more guests to the doorway, their conversations falling to whispers as they watched, some pulling out their phones to capture the quiet drama playing out in the soft lamplight of the library. The pieces moved, white and black in turn, as Margaret's confidence began to waver, small furrows appearing between her carefully groomed brows as she found herself countered again and again, her strategies meeting a quiet, unyielding defense that slowly turned into a controlled, precise offense. Elijah began to take pieces, pawns first, then a knight, the clack of each captured piece against the table sounding louder than it should in the hush that had fallen. Margaret's fingers tightened around her next piece, her eyes darting to Elijah's face as if searching for hesitation, for fear, for the stumble she was certain would come, the slip that would remind everyone in the room of the difference between him and them. But Elijah's face remained impassive, his focus absolute, as if the only thing that existed was the shifting dance of pieces across the board. He saw the opening before she did, the quiet collapse of her defense as she pushed too hard with her queen, leaving a diagonal vulnerable, a small gap that widened as he moved his bishop into place, his knight shifting to control the center, tightening the noose one quiet move at a time. He felt it in his chest, the moment the game turned, the way the pieces seemed to align themselves into a shape he had seen in books, in practice games against the library's worn-out boards, the trap closing softly, inevitably. Margaret's breath caught as she realized the danger, her hand hovering over the board, indecision flickering in her eyes as she tried to find a move that would save her position. A move that would allow her to reclaim the control she felt slipping through her fingers like water. She glanced up, meeting Elijah's gaze, and in that moment there was no amusement, no condescension, only the sharp edge of realization that she was losing, that she was not in control, that the boy across from her was not a prop for her evening's entertainment, but a player who had taken the game seriously when she had not. The guests watched, their eyes moving between the board and Margaret's face, seeing the tension, the frustration that she could not fully hide as she moved her queen, a desperate attempt to regain the initiative, to push him back. But Elijah's next move was quiet, a bishop sliding across the board to capture a pawn that opened the final path, and he lifted his eyes to hers as he spoke softly, his voice calm, carrying in the quiet room like the clear chime of a bell. Check. The word hung in the air, and for a moment, everything else faded. The guests leaned in, some holding their breath, others exchanging glances, the silver-haired man's lips twitching into a small, approving smile. Margaret stared at the board, her lips parting as she searched for a response, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for her queen, trying to block, to defend, to avoid the inevitable. Elijah watched, the pieces aligned in his mind, the strategy clear, the end within reach as he moved his knight with careful precision, pressing her position further, forcing her into a corner with no exit. Sarah pressed her hands to her mouth, tears burning in her eyes as she watched her son, her boy who had learned to be silent, to be small, to stay out of the way, now sitting with his shoulders squared, his eyes clear, his hands steady as he played with the calm authority of someone who knew exactly where he was meant to be. Margaret's queen fell, captured with a soft click that echoed like a final note in the hush of the room, and she sat back, her face pale, her eyes wide as she looked at the boy across from her. Elijah's next move was quiet, deliberate, as he slid his queen across the board, pausing before he gently tipped it forward, his eyes never leaving hers. Checkmate. The silence that followed was complete, a stillness that wrapped around the room as the guests stared, as the weight of the moment settled into the polished floors and high ceilings, into the crystal glasses and expensive dresses, into the spaces between each breath. Margaret's hands fell to her lap, her fingers clutching at the fabric of her dress as she stared at the board, unable to speak, unable to look away from the pieces frozen in their final positions. And then, softly, quietly, the applause began. A single clap from the silver-haired man, followed by another, and then another, until the room was filled with the sound, not loud, not overwhelming, but real, steady, a recognition of something undeniable that had unfolded before them. Elijah sat for a moment longer, letting the sound wash over him, feeling the tightness in his chest loosen, the warmth of it spreading through him as he finally let out the breath he had been holding. He stood, carefully, pushing back his chair as he looked down at the board, at the pieces, at the path they had taken together across the squares to this moment. His mother was there, moving to his side, her hand on his arm, her eyes shining with pride and fear and something else, something like hope, as she looked at him, at the boy who had stepped forward, who had sat down, who had played, who had won. Margaret remained seated, her eyes downcast, her hands trembling as she reached out, touching the fallen queen with a trembling finger, the applause around her a reminder that this moment was real, that it had happened, that the lines she had drawn in her mind between who could win and who could not, between who had value and who did not, had been crossed, erased, shattered by a boy she had thought invisible. And as Elijah and Sarah stepped back from the table, the guests parting for them, their eyes following them, their expressions a mix of respect and curiosity, the weight of what had happened settled into the room, into the house, into the quiet spaces where truth lived, waiting, patient, inevitable. Elijah felt the knight in his pocket, pressing against his leg, a reminder of the first move he had made, of the first step onto the board, of the game that had only just begun. And as he walked with his mother through the halls of the house that had once seemed so untouchable, the applause fading behind them, the world felt different, larger, filled with a possibility that shimmered like light on the polished floors, waiting for him to take the next move. The sound of the applause did not leave the room even after it stopped. It settled into the corners, into the marble floors and high ceilings, into the heavy curtains that shifted gently in the draft, carrying with them the breath of something that had changed. The guests dispersed slowly, lingering in small groups as they whispered in voices too low to carry, glancing back at the chessboard where the pieces remained in their final position, the white queen lying captured, the black queen standing in quiet triumph. They stepped lightly, as if the air had become fragile, aware of the weight of what they had witnessed, the way the evening had unfolded in a direction none of them had anticipated, the way the world they knew had tilted, even if only slightly, on its axis. Margaret Whitman remained seated in the library, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the pearls at her throat rising and falling with each breath she struggled to take evenly. Her eyes were fixed on the chessboard, on the configuration that should not have been possible, on the proof of her defeat written in the language of black and white squares, in the silence that pressed around her like a judgment. She tried to lift her chin, to let her practiced smile curve across her lips, but it would not come, the muscles of her face refusing to obey as her gaze traced the path of her last move, the one that had led to this, the single step that had revealed the weakness in her strategy, in her certainty, in the belief that she could never be made to lose in her own home. She felt it like a cold hand against the back of her neck, the memory of the boy's quiet voice as he spoke the word that ended the game, the way his eyes had met hers without fear, without apology, without the deference she had grown so accustomed to seeing from those who served her, who existed at the edges of her world without touching it. She could still see his hands, steady as he moved the pieces, his posture unbowed, the calm that had radiated from him as he played, as if he belonged there, as if the board had always been his, as if the house itself had no claim over him. It was an image that replayed in her mind, refusing to fade, digging beneath her skin and leaving her raw, exposed, vulnerable in a way she had never allowed herself to be. The guests who remained offered her sympathetic smiles, polite words meant to soften the blow, to frame the game as a charming moment, an entertaining diversion. But she could see the truth in their eyes, the curiosity, the slight spark of respect for the boy, the way they had looked at him as he walked from the room with his mother, their heads held high. It was a respect they had never offered her in quite the same way, a respect that came not from power or wealth, but from something undeniable, something that could not be purchased or demanded. It was a respect that had to be earned, and she felt the bitterness of it on her tongue as she forced herself to rise from the chair, her knees trembling slightly as she steadied herself with one hand against the table. In the hallway, outside the library, the conversations resumed, but there was a new tension in the air, a vibration that hummed beneath the surface of every word. The guests spoke of the boy's talent, of the game, of the way he had played with such composure, such clarity, such quiet strength that it had drawn them in, made them forget, if only for a moment, where they were and who they were supposed to be. They spoke in tones of admiration, of curiosity, of speculation about who he was, where he had learned to play, what his future might hold. They spoke of him as if he were a revelation, and in their voices there was an excitement that had nothing to do with the wine or the food or the glittering chandelier that hung above them. Sarah stood at the edge of the room, her hands folded in front of her, her eyes lowered but her ears catching every word, every breath, every note of surprise and respect in the voices around her. She felt the burn of tears she refused to let fall, her throat tight with the pride that pressed against her ribs, the pride she had held back for so long, afraid to feel it, afraid to hope, afraid to believe that her son could be seen, truly seen, in a world that had always turned its eyes away from them. She felt the shift in the room, the way the ground had moved beneath their feet, and in that moment she allowed herself to breathe, to stand straighter, to look up and see the way some of the guests glanced at her with new eyes, eyes that saw her not just as a maid, but as the mother of the boy who had won. Elijah stood beside her, quiet, his dark eyes taken in the room with the same calm he had held during the game, the same steady presence that had silenced the laughter, the same quiet authority that had made them all listen without realizing they were doing so. His hand found hers, small and warm, and for a moment they stood together in the glow of the chandelier, in the hush that still lingered in the corners, in the respect that had been earned with each careful move across the chessboard. He did not smile, but she saw the light in his eyes, the way his shoulders lifted, the way he seemed to stand taller, and in that moment she knew that something had changed, something that could not be undone. Margaret emerged from the library, her face composed, her eyes clear but hard, her posture as perfect as ever. But the guests saw the way her hands twisted the handkerchief she held, the way her lips pressed together too tightly, the way her gaze avoided the chessboard as she passed it. She offered smiles, accepted compliments, spoke with the practiced ease of a hostess who had perfected the art of conversation. But beneath her words was a silence that rang louder than anything she said, a silence that spoke of the crack in the porcelain, the fracture in the perfect surface she had crafted around herself. The evening continued, but it was different now, the laughter softer, the conversations punctuated by glances toward the chessboard, by quiet discussions of what they had seen, by the memory of the boy's quiet victory. Some of the guests left earlier than planned, offering polite excuses, while others lingered, unable to fully let go of the moment, unwilling to leave the place where they had witnessed something that felt significant, something that mattered in a way that their usual gatherings did not. When the last guest had gone and the house was quiet again, Margaret stood alone in the library, the soft glow of the lamp illuminating the chessboard, the pieces still in place, the Black Queen standing victorious. She reached out with trembling fingers, touching the piece, trying to understand, trying to reclaim the control that had slipped from her grasp. But the cold smoothness of the ivory offered no comfort, no answers. She lowered herself into the chair, staring at the board, seeing not just the pieces, but the boy's face, his calm eyes, the quiet certainty with which he had played, the unshakable presence that had filled the room and left her powerless. Sarah and Elijah walked home that night under the blanket of the dark sky, the city lights flickering around them, the warm air of the evening brushing against their skin. They did not speak as they moved through the quiet streets, their steps measured, their breath steady, the memory of the night still alive between them, unspoken but felt in every heartbeat, in every glance they shared. When they reached their small apartment, Sarah turned to her son, her hand lifting to cup his face, her thumb brushing against his cheek as she looked into his eyes, seeing the boy she had raised, the boy who had stepped forward, the boy who had shown them all who he was. She pressed her forehead to his, closing her eyes as she whispered her gratitude, her pride, her love, words that trembled in the small space between them, words that wrapped around them like a promise. Elijah's arms came around her, holding her tightly, the knight still in his pocket pressing against his leg, a reminder of the game, of the moment, of the step he had taken into a world that had tried to keep him out. They stood there for a long time, the silence of their home filled with the sound of their breathing, with the promise of what was to come, with the knowledge that the world had changed, even if only by a small, quiet step. And in the Whitman house, Margaret sat alone, the library dark around her, the chessboard before her, the pieces waiting. She could not bring herself to clear the board, to set the pieces back to their starting positions, to erase the proof of what had happened, the evidence of the game she had lost, the reminder of the boy who had walked into her home and shown her, the cracks in the porcelain she had spent her life trying to keep whole. She sat there as the hours passed, the darkness growing around her, the house silent except for the quiet ticking of the clock, each second a reminder of the moment she could not undo. The cracks had begun to spread, fine lines across the surface of the perfect life she had built, lines that would not be hidden, lines that would not be ignored, lines that would change everything. Morning came slowly to the Whitman house, pale light seeping through heavy curtains into rooms that were too quiet, their stillness pressing against the walls like a presence that could not be ignored. Margaret sat in the library, the chessboard still in front of her, untouched, the pieces frozen in the positions they had taken the night before, the Black Queen standing victorious where she had been placed with quiet certainty by the boy. Margaret could no longer think of as invisible. She traced the edge of the table with her fingers, the cold smoothness of the wood grounding her as she stared at the board, the memory of the game replaying over and over in her mind, each move, each quiet word, each glance from eyes that had not wavered. She had tried to sleep, moving from room to room in her house, the footsteps echoing against marble floors that seemed too large, too empty, the sound of her breathing loud in her ears as she found herself standing once more before the chessboard, unable to walk away. The house felt different now, its perfection cracked, its silence louder, its beauty somehow smaller. She had not expected this, had not anticipated the way a single game, a single evening, could shift the ground beneath her feet, could reveal the fragility of the world she had believed unshakable. The memory of the boy's calm, the way he had taken each piece with quiet confidence, the way he had spoken the word checkmate without triumph, only certainty, lingered in the air around her, impossible to push away. The world, outside the walls of her house, was already beginning to change, though she did not yet know it. The guests who had witnessed the game had carried the memory of it with them as they left, their conversations filled with the details, with the quiet, breathtaking way the boy had played, with the calm dignity of his mother as she had stood at the edge of the room, watching her son reveal himself to the world. They spoke of it over breakfast, over coffee, in quiet offices and crowded shops, the story moving like a ripple across the city, gathering weight as it went. Some had recorded the game on their phones, snippets of video showing the boy's hand as he moved the pieces, the final moment as he spoke the word that ended the game, the expression on Margaret's face as she realized what had happened. The video began to spread, shared first among friends and then among strangers, until it found its way into places Margaret could not control. Sarah felt the change as she moved through the streets the next morning, the way people looked at her as she walked, the way some offered small nods of acknowledgement, the way others watched with curiosity, whispering softly as she passed. She held her head high, her steps steady, the fear that had always lived at the base of her spine quiet for the first time in years, replaced by something warmer, something stronger. She could feel Elijah walking beside her, his presence solid, his eyes calm as they moved through the neighborhood, the air around them different, as if the world had decided, if only for a moment, to see them clearly. When they arrived at the house, the staff watched them with new eyes. The silence in the service entrance filled with unspoken words, with glances that carried questions they were not brave enough to ask. Elijah felt their eyes on him as he helped his mother with her bags, as he moved through the halls to the small corner where he waited while she worked. He felt the weight of the attention, but it did not press on him as it once might have. Instead, it felt like space had opened around him, room for him to breathe, to stand, to be seen without apology. In the kitchen, Sarah moved through her tasks with quiet efficiency, her hands steady as she cleaned and organized. But she could feel the tension in the air, the way the other staff members paused as they passed her, the way their eyes flicked to her face and then away. She caught fragments of their whispers, the words chess and boy and Mrs. Whitman, spoken in voices that were too low to carry but too urgent to hide. She kept her eyes on her work, but inside, her heart beat with a rhythm that felt like hope, like the first breath after being held under water for too long. Margaret avoided the staff that morning, her movements careful as she navigated her house, her mind filled with the sound of her own footsteps, with the memory of the guests' eyes as they had turned from her to the boy, with the echoes of the soft applause that had followed the end of the game. She stood at the window, looking out over the grounds, the gardens perfectly trimmed, the fountain in the courtyard bubbling softly, the world outside appearing unchanged, perfect, obedient. But she could feel the change, the crack in the surface, the way the silence pressed against her, demanding that she see it, acknowledge it, understand it. Later that day, the first calls began to come in, polite but firm, from the organizations she supported, from the social clubs she attended, from the foundations where she held influence. They wanted to discuss the video, to discuss the incident, to clarify her position, to ask if she had seen the comments, the shares, the way the story was being framed. She heard the word viral spoken with a mixture of concern and excitement, the word embarrassment carefully avoided but present in the pauses, in the careful tones of voices that had once been warm and now carried a chill. She tried to explain, to control the narrative, to assure them that it was nothing, a simple game, a moment of charity, but she could hear in their responses the hesitation, the quiet judgment, the understanding that something had happened, something they could not ignore. At home that evening, Sarah and Elijah sat together at their small kitchen table, the light from the single bulb above them casting a warm glow over the worn surface, the air filled with the quiet hum of the city outside their window. They ate in silence, the simple meal tasting better than any feast, each bite a reminder that they were here, together, that they had survived another day, that the world had seen them, if only for a moment. Elijah's eyes were bright as he looked at his mother, a small smile touching his lips as he spoke softly about the game, about the moves, about the way it had felt to play, to be there, to hold his ground. Sarah listened, her hands wrapped around her cup, her heart swelling with pride as she watched him, the boy she had raised, the boy who had shown the world what he could be. The days that followed were filled with a strange, quiet tension, the world shifting around them in small but undeniable ways. The video continued to spread, reaching news sites, social media pages, community boards, the comments filled with words of admiration, of respect, of hope. People spoke of the boy with the calm eyes, of the way he had played, of the way he had stood his ground, of the way he had shown what was possible. They spoke of him as an inspiration, as a reminder, as a symbol of something larger than the game, something that spoke to them in ways they struggled to explain, but felt deeply. For Margaret, the days were filled with calls and messages, with the polite distance of those who had once been close, with the quiet withdrawal of support from those who no longer saw her as an asset. Her name appeared in articles she had not agreed to, her face captured in moments she had not intended to share, the image of her seated at the chessboard, the moment of realization captured forever, paired with headlines that spoke of the boy, of the game, of the lesson learned. She felt the walls of her world closing in, the perfection of her life unraveling thread by thread, the cracks widening into fractures that could not be ignored. Sarah noticed the changes in the house, the way the other staff began to treat her with a quiet respect, the way some of the guests who returned to the house looked at her with cautious curiosity, with the recognition that she was no longer invisible. She moved through her days with a calm dignity, her steps measured, her eyes steady, the fear that had once lived in every breath replaced by a quiet strength that could not be taken from her. She watched Elijah as he studied in the evenings, his notebooks filled with chess diagrams, with notes, with the names of grandmasters and strategies, his mind alive with the possibilities that now seemed within reach. At night, as the city settled into its quiet rhythm, Elijah would sit by the window, the night in his hand, turning it over slowly as he looked out at the lights beyond, at the world that waited for him. He could feel the change in the air, the way the future no longer felt like a distant dream, the way it now seemed possible, tangible, within reach. The memory of the game, of the way he had moved each piece with certainty, of the way he had spoken the final word, of the way the room had fallen silent, lived in him, a reminder of what he could be, of what he was. And in the Whitman house, Margaret moved through her days like a ghost, her reflection in the mirror a stranger, the silence of her home a constant reminder of what she had lost, of what she had never truly had. The chessboard remained where it was, the pieces still in place, the black queen standing, the white queen fallen, a monument to a moment she could not undo, to a lesson she could not unlearn, to the truth that had been revealed in the quiet certainty of a boy who had known, even when she had not, that the world could change, that the lines she had drawn were not permanent, that the wave that had begun with a single move would carry beyond the walls of her house, unstoppable, undeniable. Elijah stood in front of the mirror in their small apartment, fastening the top button of the shirt his mother had pressed the night before, her careful hand smoothing each fold as if she could press blessings into the fabric with every stroke of her palm. The morning light slipped through the thin curtains, tracing soft patterns on the floor, illuminating the neat stack of notebooks on the table beside him, each one filled with diagrams of chess positions, openings carefully annotated, endgames broken down in the handwriting that had grown steadier with every day he believed in the possibility of tomorrow. He felt the weight of those pages in his mind as he straightened his shoulders, breathing in the quiet of the morning, letting it settle into him like a promise. Sarah watched him, leaning against the doorway, her arms folded, her eyes filled with the soft pride that she did not always allow herself to show. She saw not the boy who had followed her quietly through long bus rides and cleaning jobs, but the young man who had changed the air around him simply by sitting down at a chessboard and daring to play without fear. She saw the way he breathed now, the way he moved, the way he stood, the way his eyes held the light without flinching. She saw him, and she felt seen herself in that reflection, the years of quiet endurance finding shape in the curve of his shoulders and the calm certainty of his gaze. They left the apartment together, the door closing softly behind them as they stepped into the narrow hallway, the echo of their steps carrying through the quiet building. The world outside was waking slowly, the air carrying the scent of wet concrete and the promise of warmth as the sun climbed higher, the streets alive with the low hum of traffic, the calls of children heading to school, the quiet conversations of people heading to jobs that would hold them until the sun began to slip again beyond the buildings. They moved together toward the bus stop, Sarah's hand brushing lightly against Elijah's arm, the two of them walking in step, neither speaking, both feeling the quiet strength of the moment pressing around them. The bus arrived, the doors opening with a hiss, the driver nodding to them as they climbed aboard, finding seats near the middle where they could watch the city pass by as they traveled. Elijah rested his backpack on his knees, his fingers tracing the edge of the zipper as he looked out the window, the city rolling past in a blur of color and motion, each street corner familiar, each turn a part of the path that had led him to this moment. His mother sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes focused on the horizon, her breathing steady, the two of them sharing the silence without discomfort, the bond between them quiet but unbreakable. When they arrived at the school, the building loomed before them, its brick facade warm in the morning sun, the sounds of students filling the air with laughter and footsteps, the calls of friends greeting each other as they moved through the gates. Elijah paused for a moment, taking it in, the rush of it, the promise of it, the way the world seemed to open in front of him, No longer a wall, but a door. No longer something to fear, but something to step into. Sarah touched his shoulder lightly, and he turned to her, their eyes meeting, a quiet exchange of strength passing between them before he nodded, taking the first step forward, crossing the threshold into the courtyard filled with voices and movement and the promise of something new. Inside, the halls were bright, lockers lining the walls, students moving between classes, the air filled with the sounds of books closing, of laughter, of footsteps echoing against the polished floors. Elijah moved through it, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his notebooks held against his chest, his eyes open, taking in everything, the energy of it, the potential of it, the way each moment seemed to hold the promise of something he had only dared to imagine. He found his classroom, slipping into a seat near the window, opening his notebook as the teacher began to speak, the words filling the room, the lesson beginning, the world unfolding in a language he understood. In the evenings, after the sun had begun to dip below the horizon, after the streets had grown quieter, Elijah would return home, the apartment welcoming him with the familiar scent of rice and beans cooking on the stove, the sound of water running in the sink as his mother cleaned up the day's dishes, her voice humming softly to herself as she moved. They would sit together at the small table, eating dinner, talking about the day, the lessons, the games played during, lunch breaks with classmates who had begun to challenge him, to learn from him, to respect him. They would speak of the future, of the possibilities, of the dreams that were no longer only dreams but plans, tangible, close enough to reach. After dinner, Elijah would sit at the table with his notebooks, studying the games of grandmasters, the annotated plays of champions, the strategies that spoke to him in the quiet language of movement and position, of patience and vision. His mother would watch him, sometimes sitting beside him, her eyes following the lines he drew on the pages, the way his pencil moved with certainty, the way his eyes shone with the light of understanding. She saw the boy she had raised turning into the man she had always believed he could become, and she felt the years of struggle finding purpose in the quiet, determined way he leaned over his work, in the way he smiled when he found a new variation, in the way he breathed, steady and sure. Word of his game at the Whitman house continued to ripple outward, reaching community centers, local newspapers, small online forums where people spoke of the boy who had played without fear, who had won with quiet dignity, who had shown what was possible. Invitations began to come, cautious at first, from local clubs, from community leaders who wanted him to teach, to play, to share what he knew. Elijah accepted them with the same calm he had shown that night, moving into each new space with the quiet confidence that had become a part of him, sitting down across from new opponents, from young children with eager eyes, from older players who had spent years honing their craft and showing them with each move the possibility of what could be. At the community center, he began to hold small classes, gathering children from the neighborhood, setting up the old chessboards on folding tables, the pieces worn but serviceable, the room filled with the sound of laughter and concentration as they played, as they learned, as they found their own strength in the movements of the pieces across the boards. He taught them the names of the openings, the strategies, the patience required to see beyond the immediate, to think ahead, to believe in their own ability to shape the game. He saw in their eyes the same light that had begun to burn in his, the same realization that they could be more than what the world told them they were. Sarah watched from the doorway sometimes, her arms folded as she leaned against the frame, the sound of the children's voices filling the air around her, the sight of her son teaching, guiding, becoming the leader she had always known he could be. She felt the years of hardship, of quiet endurance, falling away as she watched, the sacrifices finding their purpose in the way Elijah smiled, in the way he leaned down to explain a move, in the way the children looked at him with respect, with admiration, with hope. The platform they built together, the online space where Elijah uploaded lessons, recorded games, shared strategies, began to grow, reaching children in neighborhoods across the city, across the state, across the country. Messages began to arrive, from parents thanking them, from teachers asking for guidance, from children sharing their victories, their stories, their dreams. Elijah read each message carefully, responding with encouragement, with advice, with the quiet certainty that had become his way of moving through the world. Each word a reminder that the game he had played that night was not the end, but the beginning of something larger, something that mattered. At night, as he lay in bed, the window open to the cool breeze, the sounds of the city a soft backdrop, Elijah would think of the chessboard at the Whitman house, the way the pieces had felt beneath his fingers, the way the room had fallen silent as he made his moves, the way his mother had looked at him as he stood, the way he had felt, steady, calm, certain. He would close his eyes, the memory a warm light in the darkness, the promise of what was still to come, a quiet drumbeat in his chest. And in the Whitman house, the chessboard remained, the pieces still where they had been left, the memory of the game a presence in the air, a reminder of the moment when the lines had shifted, when the world had changed, when a boy who was not supposed to win had shown them all that he could, that he would, that the first move had already been made and the rest of the game was waiting for those who were ready to see, ready to learn, ready to believe. The rain came in soft drizzles that morning, streaking the bus windows with long silver lines as Elijah leaned his forehead against the cool glass, the city sliding by in a blur of gray and green. The drops gathered, merged, fell, and started again, the pattern as steady and quiet as the breathing of the people around him, the low hum of the engine matching the even rhythm of the wheels against the wet road. It was a rain that felt like washing away the dust of the old days, rinsing the heaviness from cracked sidewalks and the tired sighs of early workers returning home from night shifts. Elijah watched as puddles formed in the dips of the street corners, each reflecting the dull light of a sky too heavy to clear, a mirror of the world above it. His mother sat beside him, her hands folded carefully in her lap, her posture straight, her eyes closed in quiet thought, her mind full of lists for the day and for the days after, for the evenings when they would return home, for the mornings when they would step back into the world and claim their place without asking permission. There was a softness in her face as she opened her eyes and glanced at Elijah, a quiet certainty that had been growing within her, a strength that came not from the absence of fear, but from the decision to no longer live beneath it. She saw him, taller now, older in the way he moved, carrying in his shoulders the weight of everything they had survived, and she knew he was not just her son, but her legacy, the proof that everything she had endured had not been wasted. They stepped off the bus as the rain eased into a gentle mist, the air cool and clean, the street wet beneath their feet, reflecting the lines of the street lights and the muted colors of the storefronts. Elijah carried his backpack over one shoulder, the weight of his notebooks a familiar pull, grounding him as he walked beside his mother through the street, nodding greetings to neighbors who now met their eyes without looking away, who now saw them, not with the pity of before, but with the quiet acknowledgement that comes when a person has shown themselves to the world and been seen for who they truly are. There were smiles from people who had watched the video, who had heard the stories, who had felt the shift in the air, the small but undeniable crack in the world's indifference. They reached the community center just as the clouds began to break, letting slivers of light fall onto the wet pavement, glinting off puddles like scattered pieces of glass. Children were already gathering inside, their voices rising in laughter and quick, excited conversations as they set up the folding tables and old chessboards, the pieces clattering gently as they were arranged, the air filled with the scent of old wood, warm dust, and the faint sweetness of the pastries someone had brought to share. Elijah moved among them, greeting each child with a quiet nod, helping to arrange the boards, watching as small hands positioned the pieces carefully, each square a promise, each move a possibility. Sarah watched from the side, her arms folded, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips as she saw the children crowd around Elijah, asking questions, laughing, challenging him with bright eyes and eager hands. She saw how he leaned down to explain a strategy, how he moved pieces to show them different paths, how he encouraged them to see the board not as a limitation but as an invitation, a space where they could practice courage, patience, foresight. She saw the way they looked at him with the open, clear trust of those who have not yet learned to doubt themselves, and she felt something ease within her, the years of quiet fear loosening their grip on her chest. After the lessons, when the children had left in small groups, their laughter still echoing in the halls, Elijah would sit alone for a while, his fingers tracing the squares of the chessboard, remembering each game he had played, each child who had looked at him with hope, each moment when he had seen the spark of understanding ignite in their eyes. He felt the weight of what he carried, not as a burden, but as a responsibility, the quiet promise he had made to himself to continue, to teach, to build something that would outlast a single evening, a single game. He knew what it meant to feel invisible, to live in the shadows of rooms too large for your presence to matter, and he would not let these children believe the lie that they did not have the right to take up space. Meanwhile, the platform they had built together continued to grow, the online videos reaching further than they had imagined, spreading to schools in distant neighborhoods, in towns and cities where children logged in late at night, hungry for knowledge, for guidance, for the chance to see themselves in the victories Elijah shared. Messages flooded in from parents, teachers, even strangers who had found inspiration in the quiet way he moved through the world, the certainty with which he played, the patience with which he taught. Each message was a reminder of the wave that had begun with a single game, the ripple that had become a tide moving quietly but powerfully through the hidden corners of the world. In the Whitman house, the air had changed. The once comforting silence now pressed against the walls like a reprimand, each footstep echoing in the marble halls, each breath a reminder of the quiet that had settled into the spaces where laughter and conversation had once lived. Margaret moved through her home like a shadow, her presence reduced to the soft rustle of her skirts against the polished floors, her hands moving to straighten already perfect picture frames, to adjust the placement of vases, to wipe dust that was not there from the edges of tables. She paused often in the doorway of the library, her eyes drawn inevitably to the chessboard, the pieces still arranged exactly as they had been on that night, the black queen standing, the white queen fallen, the memory of the boy's calm voice ringing in the silence like a bell that would not stop. The phone calls had become less frequent, the invitations fewer, the polite but cold distance of those who once had needed her presence now evident in the hesitation before each conversation, in the careful words chosen to avoid discomfort, in the subtle, undeniable exclusion that comes when a person's value is measured against the discomfort they bring to those who benefit from quiet, unchallenged power. Margaret felt the walls of her life closing in, the rooms that once felt like fortresses now feeling like cages, the weight of her own reflection in the mirrors becoming heavier with each passing day. She tried to explain it to herself, to justify it, to tell herself that it had only been a game, that it was a mistake to allow it to mean more than it had, that the world would forget in time. But she knew it was a lie. She saw it in the headlines she tried to avoid, in the conversations she overheard when she ventured out, in the cautious but pointed looks from those who recognized her face, who saw in her not the image she had spent a lifetime building, but the moment of defeat captured forever, the truth of what had been revealed in a single evening, in a single word, in the quiet dignity of a boy who had refused to be made small. One morning, unable to bear the weight of it any longer, Margaret stood in the library, her hands trembling as she reached for the chess pieces, intending to clear the board, to reset it, to erase the memory that had taken root in the room like an uninvited guest. But, as her fingers closed around the Black Queen, she froze, the smooth coolness of the piece grounding her as the memory flooded back, the boy's eyes, his calm, the silence of the room as he spoke the word, as he stood, as he walked away, leaving her there, changed, seen, known. She lowered the piece back onto the board, stepping back, her breath catching in her throat as she realized she could not erase it, could not undo it, could not pretend it had not happened. In the quiet of that room, Margaret felt something within her begin to break. The pride that had held her together now splintering under the weight of the truth she could no longer deny. The realization that the game had not been about her victory, her control, her image, but about the power she had tried to deny to another, the power she had believed she owned simply because the world had always told her it was hers. She sat down heavily in the chair, her hands covering her face as the tears came, quiet and unstoppable, the sound of her sobs filling the room, the checkmate she had tried to avoid now complete, undeniable, final. Outside, the world continued, the rain easing into sunlight, the streets drying beneath the warmth of the afternoon, the city alive with movement and promise. In a small community center, children laughed as they played, their voices bright as they moved pieces across the boards, learning the lessons of patience, strategy, and the quiet power of believing in themselves. And in that room, Elijah moved among them, teaching, guiding, reminding them with each move, each word, each smile, that the first step onto the board was the hardest, but once taken, the game was theirs to play. And so the wave continued, reaching further, touching lives, changing hearts, reminding the world that a single moment of quiet courage could become something larger than any one person, that the cracks in the porcelain of the world's certainty were not flaws, but openings through which light could enter, through which hope could grow, through which the future could take shape in the hands of those who were willing to step forward, to believe, to play. If you found this story meaningful, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Check out our other videos for more stories that will stay with you, and if this touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.